Can you hear me? Yeah, you can now. So tell me, do you think we learn better on an empty stomach or a full stomach? Empty? So you'll remember this morning I mentioned that we have this year a major sponsor of this event that has the same level of commitment to research-informed practice as the two organizing organizations, ICPA and Europris. And that sponsor is the International Association for Correctional and Forensic Psychology. You'll notice IACFP at the bottom there. And so I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Emma Reagan, who's the Director of Care and Rehabilitation for the Irish Prison Service. But more importantly for this event, she is the current president of IACFP. Emma?
I've scratched out this morning. It's good afternoon. IACFP is really proud to be a major sponsor of this 4th Correctional Research Conference, and thanks to ICPA, Europris and the Northern Ireland Prison Service for the opportunity to say just a few words about the association. IACFP is a membership organisation dedicated to advancing the voice of psychology in institutional and community corrections. And whilst our focus is primarily on the work of psychologists, we support other practitioners, students, researchers, and leaders in the field. I am on the board of directors of IACFP for about the past 5 years, and am currently serving, as Frank said, as president of the association for the next 2. I'm really lucky to share my time on the board with people like Frank, who has been literally a career mentor for me for many years now, as well as Diane Williams and Sherry Townsend, our executive director, who are all here this week. We have just launched our own strategy and cheekily have inserted that in your packs so that you can take a look at the summary of that during your time with us at the conference. Our strategy is made up of 3 key pillars and will run until 2031. 2 of these pillars I'd like to reference really briefly today. First, we are working to enhance our help for correctional helpers. From later this year, we will provide continual professional development opportunities which tackle some of the most complex conundrums we find ourselves in correctional settings at the moment. This includes, for example, providing meaningful and creative rehabilitative opportunities in the context of overcrowding, supporting staff managing healthy boundaries more effectively and managing situations where boundaries have been breached, providing offence-related work for people on remand for long periods, managing short sentences effectively, recruiting and retaining staff with a particular emphasis on working with millennials and Generation Z, managing an ageing population, managing very long sentences and palliative care in prison, and incorporating procedural justice processes and practices in prison. We are also working to enhance our mental health leadership network, and in recent years I can honestly say that this network and the connections and support that I have received as a result have sustained me in my day job. And those of us who are here from the board would be delighted to speak to any of you about the network throughout the conference. Second, we will enhance our support for correctional staff who wish to translate research to practice and practice to research. We understand that research in corrections is really hard. I've done it myself. Navigating the translation of high-quality academic research to on-the-ground practice can feel an impossible task. Statistics can be mind-boggling. Gold standard randomized control trials are tricky, and research is time-consuming. Please check out our IACFP bulletin and our journal, Criminal Justice and Behaviour, for changes over the coming months and years, which we hope will meet this strategic aim. I want to leave you with a reflection that I've had over recent days. On Sunday, I attended a cancer research fundraising day in Dublin with a friend of mine who has just recovered from breast cancer. Research during the fundraiser was described as being the single most important tool in the battle against cancer and in saving lives. And I don't know what it's like for you, but I find that research into physical health tends to be lauded much more than our research, probably because it's all about saving lives. But I suppose I've been reflecting a lot on the fact that isn't it the same for us? Doesn't our research also save lives? Save the lives of future potential victims, save the lives of the people that we work with, save the lives of our staff and our colleagues. Yes, it's more difficult for us to prove. We can't count the offence that didn't happen as a life saved in the same way we can count saving lives in oncology. However, I absolutely believe that correctional research saves lives, which is why conferences like this are so important. I'm grateful that ICPA and Europris continue to provide leadership in international correctional research, and I'm really thrilled that IACFP is joining them in this leadership. Thank you.
She doesn't need mentoring, I can tell you. She doesn't need mentoring. If you haven't had a chance to look at what's going on in both the Northern Ireland Prison Service and the Irish Prison Service, have a look, because there's some very exciting things going on at this part of the world. Okay, our next speaker, Jill Buck, is a former youth justice practitioner, and now she's the Associate Professor of Social Work at the University of Chester. Chester's a pretty little town, by the way, Jill. I've been there. They have a Roman wall. They have, I think, 1,000-year-old cathedral, I think, don't they? Yeah. It's a pretty little town. Now, I knew Chester, but I didn't really know Jill. So, of course, what do you do when you don't know? So you Google them. So I Googled Jill. And I found out that she's actually published an awful lot on the whole subject that I think is getting much more attention, on lived experience service delivery in criminal justice. She's also the principal investigator right now of a pretty significant UK research and innovation project on imagining possible futures for lived experience and participatory justice. Jill's research, I think, for me, is especially engaging because of her qualitative, participatory, and kind of a creative arts-based approach that she takes. And she arrives, I've had a chance to read a few of her papers, she arrives at some very balanced and very thoughtful conclusions, cautioning us, for example, as she does in one of her papers, that activating lived experience in social science can be experienced as empowering and therapeutic, but also as exploitive, limited, and limiting. So I'm eager to listen to Jill. She's told me she's a little nervous, but we're not going to make you nervous. Jill, please come and...
Thanks for that. Hi everyone. I am a little nervous. I was quite glad when I got here and you couldn't see me behind the lectern, but then they kindly made a short person's perch so you can see more of me. Thanks to Frank for that lovely introduction, and to the organisers. This has been no mean feat to put together, I'm sure. You've made us feel incredibly welcome in beautiful Belfast. And thank you to everyone for coming back after that gorgeous lunch. I hope I managed to keep you awake for the next 35, 40 minutes, and then there's a little bit of time for discussion as well. So there was an important bit of that introduction that Frank mentioned that I just wanted to say a little bit more about, which was that I started my career as a youth justice practitioner, a social worker in a youth offending service in the north of England, to be exact. And the research that I've done since then, that I'm going to introduce you to today, has not only changed me as a practitioner significantly, but also changed me as a researcher in terms of the methods that I use. So I hope this might inspire you as researchers and practitioners in the room to think about some different methods and ways of working that are available to us. I'm talking today for a little while about peer mentoring in criminal justice as a growing part of the correctional ecosystem in the UK and beyond. And Faye alluded earlier to the fact that some of our dominant R&R approaches can be a little bit deficit-based. I'm going to argue that peer mentoring potentially is more hope and strengths-based. So that's the starting point. I'm going to begin with some brief definitions of how peer mentoring has been understood, before arguing that the practice of people supporting and advocating for their peers in criminal justice is not a new trend. Rather, there's a long history dating back to at least the 18th century of people drawing on their lived experiences to shape more humane and effective justice systems. Not only does peer mentoring have a long history, but it can also be found internationally. I'll touch on some examples from around the world to illustrate the prevalence of the practice beyond the UK. And the main part of the talk will focus on a study of present-day peer mentoring in England. I'll introduce briefly the research sites and the methods used before summarising the findings, including what we learned about identity, agency, values, change and power. These core themes were constructed from the narratives of those people directly involved in peer mentoring. And finally, I'm going to spend just a little time inviting us to consider what comes next, including how lived experience movements are building momentum, challenging our established narratives and practices, and seeking changes not only to individuals' lives, but also to wider social systems. And the images on the slides that you can see today are all from imprisoned artists, people in prison who've produced art for the Koestler Awards. I'll come back to the history of Koestler in a little while if you're not familiar. So how has peer mentoring in criminal justice been defined? When the UK government first advocated for the practice as part of the now failed Transforming Rehabilitation policy, Justice Secretary Chris Grayling described it as wise friends or old lags helping offenders on the straight and narrow. In my own work, I've tried to avoid some of the negative labelling used here and broaden the definition to community members, often with lived experiences of criminal justice, working or volunteering in helping relationships. Now, it can be helpful to have these kind of short summaries to ground the discussion, but defining peer mentoring is actually incredibly hard. In fact, Bozeman and Feeney scoped definitions of mentoring in 2007 and found no fewer than 13 different descriptions based just on academic articles between 1984 and 2005. The idea of a peer or peerhood is also multiply defined. Schinkel and White have used the definition of people having shared experiences with the client, which they use to provide practical and emotional help outside the realms of a professional relationship. But in the projects I visited, peerhood was defined differently again, perhaps sometimes as the same gender, people of the same gender or the same age supporting each other, or even just living in the same locality. For example, university students seeking some support experience with local marginalised groups. And this diversity proves really challenging, not just for defining what peer mentoring is, but also then if we're going to try and measure what the impacts of that intervention are, given that this can be a really diverse and differently understood practice. Now, I've been immersed, what a joy, in the last 5 months in historical archives for a slightly different project, but lots of the findings were really relevant to today. So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to give you a little bit of the history of peer-led approaches in criminal justice. So peer-led work, peer mentoring, lived experience work is often seen as a modern phenomenon, or people might say it's a trend or a fad. But such work has deep historical roots that far preempt today's neoliberal aims to reduce formal state welfare provision. For example, some of the UK's most prominent criminal justice charities, including the Howard League for Penal Reform and Koestler Arts, were born of people who'd experienced imprisonment and then began advocating on behalf of their peers. The Howard League was founded in honour of John Howard, who'd been a prisoner of war in 1756 before launching the movement for prison reform in Britain. On release from his captivity, Howard immediately reported the abuses of prisoners that he'd witnessed, launching the beginning of his prison reform enterprise. In the 1960s, Arthur Koestler, a formerly incarcerated writer and activist, founded what would become the National Koestler Art Awards. Motivated by his own experiences of imprisonment, Koestler sought to offer creative opportunities to people in custody, initially funding the awards himself. Koestler Arts, and you'll see lots of those materials on this slide deck, marked its 60th anniversary in 2022, having grown into a significant platform for showcasing the creative work of people in custody. Beyond these nationally recognised figures, there is also a long history of everyday people supporting their peers in criminal justice. Records from Dartmoor Prison, for example, in 1813, reveal how African American prisoners developed a progressive model of prisoner peer support, establishing an entire recreational community involving education, sports, music, and dramatic productions, including Shakespearean plays. This early form of structured interaction enabled prisoners to teach, guide, and support one another. Throughout the 1800s, public petitions, these are formal written requests that a person makes to a higher power for a favour or to correct an injustice, provide us with further evidence of peer support in prisons, but also in convict hulks or prison ships and in colonial transportation settings. These have included instances of men and women tending to fellow detainees during typhus outbreaks, offering advice and instructing others in reading, writing and accounts. In fact, England's prisons could scarcely have functioned during the 19th century without the support efforts of prisoners, including wardsmen and wardswomen who supervised the employment of their peers in exchange for additional bread and beef, and monitors and monitresses who provided education to their fellow inmates, making Elizabeth Fry's penal reform efforts a practical possibility. More recently, in 1949, a prisoner known as Danny C. played a pivotal role in founding Narcotics Anonymous. What began as a grassroots effort to support people struggling with addiction evolved into a large formal network of mutual aid. Danny C. not only helped to establish peer-to-peer recovery groups in carceral settings and in the community, but also a national advisory council and educational groups for parents of people living with addiction. Today, NA operates more than 58,000 meetings across 131 countries. And together, these historical activities illustrate an established history of peer support, mutual aid, and prisoner-led initiatives within criminal justice, going back to at least the 19th century. In the present day, examples of peer mentoring and support can be found across the globe. For example, the Samaritans Prisoner Listener Scheme operates in prisons across the UK and Ireland, training prisoners to provide confidential support to fellow inmates in distress. Prisoner listeners provide frontline, life-saving responses to crisis levels of self-harm and suicide in prisons. In Ireland and Australia, the Red Cross train prisoners in peer health education. In the USA's largest maximum security prison, Angola, people serving life sentences mentor others, teaching them job skills and moral reasoning. In Latin America, where prisons are overcrowded and under-resourced, prisoners induct newcomers and provide necessities such as food and medicine. And in Rwanda, a peer-led governance model emerged where inmates not only helped to distribute food and water to other prisoners, but also determined rewards and punishments for their peers. International examples of peer mentoring also don't stop at the prison gate. As people transition from custody to the community, the need for support often intensifies. In Australia, women leaving prison often face significant gaps in post-release services. Peer mentoring, delivered by women with lived experience, supplements scarce official resources. In Finland, the discontinuation of the state's probation and aftercare association left a void that was quickly filled by peer-led organisations supporting ex-prisoners and their families. And more broadly, peer mentoring is growing in community settings across the UK, Ireland, Sweden, and the USA. And if you weren't in the Youth Justice panel just before this one, do check out the work of Jarell Daniels, where there was an excellent model of collaborative justice that I didn't know about, but I've learnt about today, so thank you. Taken together, these examples suggest that peer mentoring is part of a widespread response to the challenges of incarceration and criminalisation across diverse cultures and time periods. Yet despite its prominence, remarkably little research has been done in this area. So to start to bridge this gap, Keele University in England and CLINCS, which is an umbrella organisation supporting the voluntary sector in criminal justice, generously funded my PhD study of peer mentoring. They were particularly interested in whether peer mentoring could promote desistance from crime. And spoiler alert, yes it can, but probably not on its own, and many of its potentials reach beyond individual desistance, which I'll come on to. The study employed a qualitative design to try and understand the ways that mentoring was meaningful to participants, including semi-structured interviews with 18 mentors, 20 mentees, 4 mentoring coordinators, and 2 probation staff who were partnering with one of the organisations I visited. Observations of practice were also undertaken. For example, I was allowed to sit in and watch some volunteer recruitment and to take part as a participant observer in some training, and also to sit in on a peer support group. Participants whose names were anonymised were drawn from mentoring settings in the north of England. Their organisations were also anonymised, but included a probation-based project, a care leavers service for people who'd grown up in local authority care, a women's employment project, and a young women's service. And all of these community-based resources had links into prison, so we're doing some through the gate works as well. A purposive sampling method was adopted, meaning that projects were only contacted if they were delivering peer mentoring in criminal justice contexts. Data were analysed using thematic analysis, which is a structured method for interpreting themes within data, and enhanced using elements of Carol Gilligan's voice method, which is multifaceted but also involves researchers creating I-poems from participants' first-person responses within the interview transcripts. And she says that those I-poems provide a kind of sonograph to the psyche. Poetry was chosen as an additional data analysis method because it can inspire emotional reactions in readers and connect readers to a deep personal understanding of the subjects of the data. The 5 themes developed as a result of this analysis, which I'm going to introduce briefly today, were identity, agency, values, change, and power. In terms of identity, this refers to the perceived importance of people drawing on their lived experience. So Ben, who's a mentee or somebody who uses a mentoring service, says, "It does seem to work better when you've actually been there. That's how I personally feel anyway. Somebody who's just read it from a book isn't the same as somebody who's actually been there and done it." And Fiona, also a mentee, "You can't learn experience. You can pick pointers up, but you can't get that life skill, that extra that you need that completes it. You can't get it unless you've seen it, been there, got somewhere, you know." And Brad, who's a mentor, theorises why this might be. They can see people like me that have come from an offending or drug-using background, and they can say, well, look, they've done it, why can't I do it? They've gone straight, they've sorted their lives out, they've got good jobs, why can't I do it? That's the basic idea behind it. Lots of the peer mentors and mentees spoke about the authenticity or importance of this ex-offender identity and how it gave people a sense that the mentor understands me because they've been through similar challenges. And they can also be inspirational by showing how change could happen, that I could turn my life around, or that I could stop being involved with this thing that's causing me problems. There was also an additional element to the identity theme, as Georgie, a mentee, introduces. She says, I want to feel the way they did. They weren't beaming out happiness, but they weren't sad. There was that content in their life that they were offering to other people to help them, and I wanted to be able to do that. This could be interpreted as a form of reciprocity, in that mentees describe a wish to help others in ways that they've been helped. But it also resembles a form of Girardian mimesis. René Girard theorised that role models direct our desires towards something by desiring it themselves. In this case, mentees come to imitate their mentor's desire to help or to give. While this process might not necessarily be the intended aim of mentoring projects, it could have unintended benefits. For example, Burnett and Maruna have noted that real reintegration requires more than physical re-entry. It also involves earning one's place back in the moral community. If peer mentoring results in mentees becoming helpers, volunteers or paid, it encourages a number of processes which underpin and maintain desistance. People get involved with an activity that decreases their chances of arrest. It enables them to demonstrate some moral reparation, and it offers a platform for people to try and reframe their past in new ways, distinguishing between the old me and the new or real me, the person who is caring towards others and able to use their past to help others. Moving now to agency. This refers to people gaining a sense of choice, control, or self-direction. So for Candice, I feel more confident in myself. And for Janet, they've made me realise what I'm good at. But mentees also outline the roles their peers play in gaining these perspectives. You sort of have their voices at a time when you need them going on in your head, says Lynn, who was a mentee and went on to become a mentor. People appear to develop a sense of agency through dialogue, not just with their peers, but with their environments. Peer mentoring is frequently described as something separate to modern managerialist probation approaches. It overtly rejects badges of authority and being buzzed through locked doors, in favour of a more equal or egalitarian, often leisure-based activity. Mentees are offered an opportunity to practice their new identity in community-based settings and to embed new routines, engaging in activities that they find pleasurable. As a result, they come to hold new perspectives of themselves and new hopes for the future. Mentors, in turn, reinforce these new identity performances by encouraging a positive sense of self and recognising and applauding the efforts that mentees are making. In this light, the will to heal or change is not a prerequisite of desistance, but desistance emerges falteringly as a dialogue between the self, socially available spaces, and socially available recognition. The third theme, values or conditions of peer mentoring, highlights that there's more to mentoring than having a shared criminalised identity or even role modelling. That it's not just anyone with lived experience in this role that matters, but the values that mentors are practising with. So as Cam, who's a mentoring coordinator with lived experience, says, being an ex-offender alone doesn't qualify you. We want to be good mentors. So I tried to understand how people defined a good mentor and identified 3 core conditions: caring, listening, and taking small steps. Care is quite simply conceived of as the opposite of judgment, of expectation, and of obligatory intervention. It involves fostering deep personal connections and building people's esteem. Listening is an intervention in itself. It enables people to unburden themselves of problems, see themselves as capable of self-direction, especially when conditions feel overwhelming to them, and to feel heard. This is the condition I spend the most time drilling into my own social work students in my teaching, because I think we often think we're listening as professionals, but most often we're listening with an agenda, to fill in a risk assessment or to fill in a form or to get a plan put together. We're not truly listening to the person and entering into dialogue with them about what they see as important in their life. And mentees were often saying this is the first time they'd felt truly listened to by somebody in a criminal justice setting. And the last of the 3 conditions is small steps or manageable goals. These provide opportunities to demonstrate success, however small that might be. When success can be felt, it becomes a reality. In practical terms, mentees are conditioned to have hope. I look back with a little bit of embarrassment and regret now at some of my own youth justice practice because, and some of you in the room might recognise this, we'd have huge plans for young people, multidisciplinary plans, multi-professionals coming in to fix what was needed with that young person, ticking our boxes about what we as multiple professionals thought needed to be done. We maybe didn't think enough about breaking these aims down into manageable enough steps for the young person. And what mentors often instinctively knew is that sometimes the smallest of steps, like opening your curtains or going to the local shop, was the thing that was needed, just to start to build the relationship and build confidence, and that was really important to people. So peer mentoring can become a safe space to release suffering, gain a new sense of personal self-direction and practice success, but this is more likely when mentors genuinely care, deeply listen, and set small, realistic goals. And finally, are tolerant of slip-ups, which we know can be part of the desistance journey. In terms of change, peer mentoring often seeks to inspire personal change, but people also point to required changes external to themselves, including transformations in public perceptions and criminal justice practices. Personal change came across as really terrifying and difficult, as Don explains. Coming off drugs, stopping grafting, it's not been easy, it frightens me. I have nothing. I've been alcoholic since I was 13. Fear could also be about living life without self-medication and known routines, or it could be a tangible fear of social isolation and the threat of physical harm as people leave known routines behind. So Steve explains, the actual word change used to terrify me. I used to be coming out of prison thinking, what am I going to do? Because I didn't have any mates. I lost them years ago. The only people I had were associates. When I started to go running with a police officer as part of an offender management programme, it was like, oh my God, I'm going to get labelled a grass. So I just used to keep all that stuff really low key. When you go to prison a grass, you're like someone who harms old people or women or children. They're all classed as one person, you know, that get beat up. Fear could also be, as is the case for many women who become criminalised, related to the additional pressure of having lived with the terror of domestic abuse as a norm. So Eve, a mentee, says, I didn't know who I was and I had to find myself. And I was so scared because I was like, I couldn't wear certain things, I couldn't do certain things, I couldn't go to my mum and dad's because he was like, where are you going? What are you doing? What time will you be back? I couldn't go to the shop because he'd be texting me. So I got to a point where I didn't even know who I was. But peer mentoring can potentially offer a unique antidote to some of these terrors. As Lynn explains, seeing the change helps you not be scared of the change, because a lot of people are. I was scared of change, but you don't feel like you're going it alone because people have gone there before you. And it's not like there's somebody in a suit saying this and that. They've more of an understanding of where you are psychologically. So while personal change can be physically dangerous, materially humbling and emotionally isolating, mentors can reassure people through these processes. The visibility of role models evidences that change is possible and builds a sense of self-belief even if relapses do occur. In addition to supporting personal change, mentors also sought changes to criminal justice itself. So Adam, a lived experience coordinator, my experience guided how the system could be different. We ex-offenders complement what's already going on. We're able to add an additional perspective. And the probation manager who first employed Adam agreed with this assessment. All of our ex-offender staff changed because of their own connections, not probation. and we know that's borne out by the desistance literature. That's not to say that probation doesn't help, but that there are other strategies available outside of professional understanding. Examples included Paula, a mentor whose partner had died from addiction-related complications. She set up a concerned others group at a women's centre because many people in mentoring have experienced addiction in their immediate circle, and she saw it as all connected. Paula therefore stepped into the gap of existing services. Similarly, Lol, a mentoring coordinator, is concerned about the lack of focus on the relationship between local authority care and prison. As a care leaver himself, this issue had particular resonance. 25% plus of those in prisons can say they've been in care. You can't just take people from the care system and say they're bad people so they end up there. There must be something happening systemic. So we're trying to work out, our project is trying to work out where those gaps exist in terms of that system. However, these efforts often rely on goodwill and patronage. We rely on professionals. We're not to tread on toes. It's a team effort, not duplicating. It depends on the personality of the offender manager. Some are happy to allow us authority, others want to control the work, know everything that we're doing. So whether individual or structural, change was frequently presented as a struggle. People spoke of a tension between known habits and unknown futures, between wanting help and seeing authority as dangerous. They spoke of desires to reimagine criminal justice services and of having their experiences controlled or appropriated by more powerful players, which leads on to the final theme of power. So this theme acknowledges interpersonal and social tensions present in peer mentoring. It reveals that at times, these mentoring relationships are not hugely different from the relationships you might recognise between a probation officer and a person on probation, or a prison officer and someone in prison. Very often they're quite directive and quite disciplinary. For example, one mentor noted, while they don't personally breach or return people to court, they do have to pass on attendance feedback to offender managers, and this can be a really testing part of their role. Despite mentoring striving to be more equal, often a reciprocally supportive dynamic, there is a need to recognise continuing interrelationships of power between individuals. And these power dynamics are not predictable and can sometimes be inverted. For example, one mentee noted to me she sometimes feels her mentor needs more support than she does and might not be ready yet to support others. Another mentor felt unable to intervene given he'd viewed his mentee as higher up the pecking order than him. So Steve again, one lad was put on mentoring and he was a little bit, not intimidating, it's because I knew him, how big he was from my past and what connections he's got. I think I actually felt a bit uncomfortable because I didn't think I could offer him. I did try a different tack with him, but I kept repeating myself saying, I'm not trying to tell you what to do. Obviously, you do what you want, but, you know, I kept apologising because I didn't want him to think I was trying to, because I knew in his head he was thinking, what are you doing here? I'm too engrossed, you know? Given these relational dynamics, assessing mentors' own healing and support requirements and the appropriateness of matching people becomes really important for those running these schemes. Power was also at play in how work was sanctioned or blocked, as Lol explains. My offences are not 2 weeks old, they're many, many years old, and principally as a young offender, by the way, and related to coming through the care system. The prison was interested in supporting us to do peer mentoring, but couldn't find practitioners to support the through the gate mechanism. And because I'm an ex-offender, when they do enhanced security clearance for me, it says no. So the Ministry of Justice have come up with this Standard Plus, which is not quite basic clearance and it's nowhere near enhanced, it's somewhere between the two. But what it does allow is each prison to do its own local risk assessment. But this has already been noted that can include local diversity, and we are seeing differences in the decisions that prisons are making about allowing people in. Even if mentors gain entry, they're often subject to additional surveillance or shaming. For example, Adam, I've had it going into Prison Y as a paid member of probation staff. I've gone there to talk to the client getting ready to be released. I've talked about my past and what I'm doing now and how that qualifies me to offer that support, just so he knows he can have confidence in me and build the relationship. By the time I've got back here to the office, there had been this phone call from the head of prison security. Next time he sends an offender up here to do visits, we'd like to be notified beforehand. And we were saying he's not an offender, he's a paid member of trust staff. But there was just this hoo-ha about it. So relations of power inside and outside mentoring can block work, sanction work, and determine its shape. What emerges in practice is a constant tussle in which mentors often accept professional norms and social practices, but also press at the edges of received wisdom. As I get ready to close and hear any questions, I'd just like to briefly reflect on some key challenges for the development of peer mentoring, and Frank referred to this. So I don't want to say too much other than to say we've seen some awful examples in this paper of people being publicly humiliated as they're going in to deliver, for example, inside-out programs or peer mentoring support, sometimes outed in front of colleagues or even students, being made to use different toilets than the people who are running the project. So I think what we're proposing in this paper is, in addition to collective allegiances and support for the people doing the work, we need a substantial project of consciousness raising with non-criminalised power holders, many of us in this room, to highlight how stigma can be reduced and allyship developed. And just on the theme of allyship, I'm going to cite Shad Maruna, writing in the Irish Probation Journal, who argued that the desistance movement is already well underway. And he cites the examples of All of Us or None in the USA and Unlock in the UK, which was initiated and is led by former prisoners and works to highlight to reduce disproportionate stigma and obstacles of criminal records. And this is my very last point. What next? How do we move from value and lived experience rhetorically to embedding it meaningfully in systems of knowledge production and practice innovation? As part of our own contribution to this agenda, and our team is made up predominantly of people who've formerly lived in prison, we're undertaking a large-scale study of lived experience involvement across the UK and Ireland, aiming to trace the past, present and possible future practices of lived experience used in speculative design. So if you are, or you know of, any organisations that are meaningfully involving people with lived experience and would be interested in talking to us, please visit the website or get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jill. You just really made it come alive, and I think in a lot of ways clarified how complicated this can be in terms of really maximizing the possible contribution of peer mentoring within our system. And I guess I want to ask just one question, then turn it to, if you had to put your finger on one thing that we need to do to make the best possible use of peer mentoring to improve the lives of the folks that we work with, what is it that you put your finger on? One thing.
I'm going to cheat and give you two. My
Two
mind
things,
went
okay.
straight to trauma-informed support, but that is twofold, because before you get to proper trauma-informed support for the people doing this work, you have to look at us. Like I said at the beginning, this work has changed me. I came into this work unknowingly with a lot of stigma and low expectations around people with criminal convictions, thinking I had the tools to fix and improve. And there is an element of exchange in the work that I do now. I do still have tools that are useful to people, but I'd underestimated the wealth of knowledge that the people I work with and that are doing this mentoring work bring to us. So I think it's a bit of humbling that's needed on professionals' part to be open to different types of experience and knowledge. And related to that, once we've got people in those spaces, how are we taking care of them? Because most, not all, but most people who come to this work are also healing through their own early childhood trauma or recent traumas. So it's not enough to just offer somebody a volunteer role, offer somebody a job, and not offer support for that ongoing trauma work that might be needed.
Yeah. Do you think that the system sort of beats out of us the caring, listening, and taking small steps kind of thing?
Yes.
I mean, do you think the system beats it out of us?
I think it's less obvious than a beating, because honestly, I look back at some of the stuff I did when I was a youth justice officer thinking I was doing good stuff. Like, my asset forms looked beautiful, I wrote beautiful pre-sentence reports, got commendations from magistrates. But it was all what I wanted to say. It was all what I thought needed to be done. I might have took advice from professionals. I may have even tokenistically, if I'm honest, involved young people and families, but nowhere near enough as I should have been doing. Right. And nobody ever picked me up on that, because the expectation of the system is that we are the experts directing that work. Yeah. So that's one of the shifts that needs to happen.
So I'm going to turn it to the audience, and this time, if you're not going to ask questions after this talk, then I wonder. So who's got a microphone? I can't see.
There's a couple of hands here. Do you want a microphone? I could just see a wave in the dark.
Somebody waving?
Just this row. Is it Faye?
Thank you for your talk. Very interesting. I have two sort of related questions. Typically, in the incarceration setting, there's always this notion that a person should not have control over another person because of the potential, abuse or, just sets off the environment. So how does peer mentoring deal with that particular issue?
So yesterday I was talking to somebody who won't out, who is delivering a peer mentoring project in prisons, and talked about how they're seeing real culture change in prisons because of the mentoring programme. And that's because it doesn't position men as prisoners, but as something other than, as a potential leader, as a potential carer, as a potential signpost to other things, and that is having healing impacts not just for the men involved, but for the prison culture itself, enabling the prison culture to see people as human beings. And because I'd only been stuck in the archives last week, I remember a quote coming from an 18th century prison inspector who said, "We should never give prisoners the belief that they are anything other than prisoners. They should," which is kind of what you were alluding to there with the question. And that's the difference in, I guess, ideologies behind whether this work should be supported or not. Is it about creating more humane systems and offering people routes out, or is it about keeping people dehumanised and disempowered? And I know where I stand, but not all colleagues agree with me.
Yeah, good point. Very good point. Hands up.
One here. Just to the left, Frank. The front.
In the front? Beverly?
Jill, can I just ask about the support, or have you identified a need to support mentors within a custodial setting? And what's your advice on that, on the levels and types of support that should be made available to mentors?
Okay. I should say for this study, the majority of the settings were community-based. Christian Perrin has done a lot of work in custody-based settings, so I'd encourage you to look at his work. But we did, a couple of years ago, co-author a reflective piece with people who had previously worked as prison listeners in prison. And the overwhelming theme of that work was we were not supported enough. The support, Samaritans do an amazing job and life-saving work. This isn't an attack on the Samaritans, and they were keen that it didn't become that, the people who took part. But Samaritans offer usually monthly group supervision for prison listeners. It doesn't always happen, not always because of the Samaritans, but because a security issue comes up or for some other reason. But even if it's happening monthly, the volunteers were saying it really wasn't enough. Sometimes there's a prison officer in the room, so you can't always really speak openly. And They were talking about the times that they were at work. So it's not just about that offload opportunity. Samaritans are not in a position to line manage people in prison. That's done by the prisons themselves. And there often isn't a clocking off time for, and we know from other work about how staff working in these settings burn out and become vicariously harmed by their work, that one of the biggest risk factors is the hours that you spend doing that work. Prison listeners are often on duty 24 hours a day, and talked about going down to breakfast to check that the person that they were supporting was still alive the next day, and no opportunity to offload that. So that's why when Frank asked the question, trauma-informed support, supervision, management regularly is really needed.
How do you avoid, Jill, what you referred to? I think it was Finland. You said that they filled the void, right? How do you avoid that? Because I mean, I do sense that peer mentoring, peer support is getting more popular right now. For some reason, I just sense there's a bit of a movement. But how do you avoid the system sort of using folks in that way to fill the void that the system should be filling? Do you follow what I'm trying to say?
I do, and I don't think I've got the answer for how this. People are very aware this is an issue, that their work is being kind of appropriated to fill the role back of the state. Yeah. It's not just happening with peer supporters, it's happening with people working in charities more broadly. The voluntary sector is stepping in. Voluntary sector workforce, penal voluntary sector is bigger than prison and probation staff combined. We barely research what's going on in that sector, and it really is picking up the pieces. One of the ways that bigger organisations have tried to do it is get kind of a collective voice behind resisting things that they don't agree with, that they don't want to. It's very hard to say no to something if you're reliant on that contract and there's only 3 of you doing the work. But if you're that's why that collective allegiance is it's more important to advocate for yourself and others.
Yeah. Anybody in the audience have had some experience working with peer mentors or peer support and want to raise some issues? Anybody? Boy. You got a question? We need a mic over here, I think.
I had a question because before you asked the question, Frank, so it's actually to reverse your question, because I mean, there's a lot of talk in academic environments about peer mentoring, but I wonder, from your experience in the UK, in England and Wales particularly, so my question is twofold, probably there are 2 questions in one. So the first question is, are there incentives to make it easier for charities to hire people as well as you know, just as social workers and among former incarcerated persons, so or as volunteers, you know, helping out with people in prison. And so the question probably is, to put it in other terms, what is the scale of the peer mentoring movement in the UK?
Okay.
And if it's gaining momentum, is it because there are some sort of incentives making it more palatable, so to speak? I don't know. And the other question, which is kind of the opposite of what Frank just said, especially coming from a system in Italy where you know, prisoners are still very much institutionalized, and there's a lot of suspicion probably from prison authorities vis-a-vis volunteers in general, and even more so if they are formerly incarcerated people, is because you talked about power, but I don't know if you mentioned, you know, did you in your research experience or find any climate of suspicion or you know, some opposition vis-a-vis peer mentoring on the part of prison authorities? That's it.
Okay, so I'll start with the second question because it's the potentially more negative answer.
The first question was about scale, right? Adriana, I think? Yeah.
So in terms of, yes, there are times where people who've done peer mentoring work in prison will tell you this themselves. I did it to get out of my cell initially. That was the incentive. It wasn't money incentive. Very often these jobs are voluntary. I wanted time out of my cell. I wanted a bit of self-development. There are occasions where people say I'm put under pressure to pass drugs between wings if I've got, or notes between people, love letters between wings if I've got movement within the prison. And I don't think prisons yet are quite doing well enough at protecting people around that kind of pressure. So I don't want to sugarcoat it. There are problems. It's not a silver bullet. However, you asked about incentives, and I think the incentive for the charitable sector and the state sector is clearly there given the numbers that we're seeing. So Clinks surveyed the voluntary sector in England and Wales recently, and something like 96% of organisations surveyed involve people, consult them in some way in the work that we're doing, people with lived experience. And smaller numbers, but still significant, employed people as paid workers and employed people in leadership positions. And it gets smaller the higher up the scale you go, which is one of the complaints of people who come into this world. I can get a job or I can get a voluntary position, but I can't break this glass ceiling. But we're seeing slight shifts. We are seeing leadership programs come about. So for me, the incentive seems to be from the organisation side. These people have a lot to offer our organisations. We're employing, we're consulting, they've got knowledge we necessarily don't have. But the financial incentives that I've seen are not really there. That's just something that people are doing with very little or no money.
But the career incentive is there, though, right? Wanting to kind of do social work, wanting to give
social
back,
work in England and Wales, I'm ashamed to say, is not a progression route for the most of the people doing this work, because we DBS check or police check everybody who comes to the social work discipline. There's a movement in the USA trying to bring our discipline in so that you could learn the academic side of our world. You might not necessarily be able to go on placements, but you can get that degree and then kind of prove yourself as you go along. That's a kind of another story. But yeah, there is progression opportunities. People go on to lead organisations. Right. One of the problems is, because people often come into it because it's the only role available to them. I've got two amazing colleagues who are great at what they do, but they said, we set up this organisation up because we couldn't get any other job. And now what do? We don't really want to continue doing this, but there are no other jobs available to us. So I think part of the push factor is the lack of employment opportunities for people with convictions.
One last chance. Anybody else? A hand up there, I see.
My question is going to be really boring now, all right? But first of all, it was a great presentation.
Thanks.
So,
you helped settle my nerves over lunch, telling me about your great project.
Yeah, well, we'll forget about that. This one's going to be about research methods. That's why it's going to be boring.
Okay.
You used thematic analysis.
Yes.
Did you code it manually, or did you use, just for my own?
Manually is the short answer. I had a little play with NVivo, got stuck down a rabbit hole.
Oh my God, don't even mention it. Don't even mention it. It's like mentioning the war. All right?
Yeah.
What you call it? And the other thing was, is your work available through open access anywhere?
Yes, so everything through this project is open access data and publications. If you go on the website, there is free, also practitioner-facing reports, shorter versions, and we've got a lived experience advisory board that's turning everything that we do longer term into open, freely accessible, illustrated work, so yeah.
And the very last boring question was, the paper you showed, the heading of there,
this is how it feels.
Yeah, is that actually available on?
That's open access as well.
That's open access.
Lovely.
I read that paper just before I came here. So.
Yeah, that's okay. So that's all my questions.
Great, thank you. Jill, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.